very much looking forward to having this conversation about democracy. Democracy is important all over the world, and the role history plays, and taking the time to think about our responsibilities in this moment of time. And we do that as Americans, and we do that as legislators to the most democratic body anywhere in the world, United States Congress, in the House of Representatives. And therefore, we know that the stakes are high. And to that, there's no question, and it's clear. But unfortunately, not even here in the United States are we safe from this growing global threat. I recall watching the events of January 6th from my window where I'm sitting now, where I could see both the east and the west sides of the steps of the Capitol. And I watched mob rush the Capitol building in an attempt to overturn the results of our democratic elections. And as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and in all my conversations with heads of states and my counterparts around the world, the concerns are the same. They wondered what January 6th meant about the resilience of the United States democracy and the symbol that we serve abroad. They worried what this signified about the threats they are seeing in their own respective nations, and whether the rise of authoritarianism will continue to intensify and threaten their own institutions. We may have the world's longest lasting constitutional democracy, but it's not perfect. We strive to become a more perfect nation. And at the time of our nation's founding, our Constitution's founding premise that all men are created equal did not include people who look like me. It did not include women. Even today, we see voting rights under siege in state after state. Those who want to see democracy fail, who justify the authoritarian regimes by pointing to our flaws, hold these examples up as proof that their model is a better alternative. But I'm here to tell you they're wrong. And they fundamentally misunderstand the foundation of our moral authority. The power of America's example to the world is not that we're perfect. It is that we work to make America become a more perfect union, to overcome discrimination and injustice. Progress, of course, isn't a straight line, but it's my role as chair to help guide it. And we must do so by being honest about the challenges ahead of us and calling out human rights injustices around the world, wherever and whenever they occur. In this committee, we look at the front lines of democracy abroad and try to elevate the brave actors in Belarus, Hong Kong, or Haiti. And today's guests are leading historians and thinkers about democracy, totalitarianism, and the lessons we can learn from history when thinking about today's world. So I thank you both for joining. I think we'll have an interesting dialogue and conversation this morning, and I look forward to that conversation. So before we do that, let me turn to Representative Joe Wilson, who is from the great state of South Carolina and the ranking member of the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism Subcommittee, for any remarks he'd like to make. Thank you. I now yield to Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Greg Meese, for your terrific leadership. We appreciate you very much. And I want to thank you for holding this roundtable discussion on the importance of bolstering democracy to counter the rise of authoritarianism. Democracy is under constant threat as we see adversaries like China, Putin, and Iran seeking to export instability and undermine systems in an attempt to weaken democracies around the globe. The pandemic has given cover to authoritarians and would want to be dictators to suppress democratic movements in their own countries under the guise of emergency declarations. The tools at their disposal to do so, both at home and abroad, have become increasingly sophisticated and insidious. As we watch the threat to Ukraine's sovereignty by Putin taking place in real time, threatening the safety of Ukrainian families, 43 million people at risk of mass murder, with 14,000 persons already killed by Russian aggression, and the energy and independence of Europe. It serves as a reminder that the best tool against authoritarian expansion is deterrence in every form to achieve peace through strength. While this effort can and must be bipartisan, the Biden administration's failure to fully utilize existing mechanisms like enforcement of sanctions to further deter the will of dictators is disappointing. As negotiations in Vienna are taking place, the Iranian regime continues its race toward a nuclear weapon while continuing to export terrorism and missiles to destabilize every country it touches, with the drone attacks on Saudi Arabia and the drone attacks on the United Arab Emirates just this week. Concessions to authoritarians with no meaningful indicators of changed behavior simply throws out meaningful leverage that democracies cannot afford to lose. As the world prepares for the Winter Olympics to begin in Beijing, an event typically surrounded with excitement and pride, it's tainted by the genocide being committed against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Perhaps no population feels the effects of the CCP's threat to democracy more than the 23 million people of Taiwan, who live under constant threat of invasion and forced reunification. The CCP's expansion playbook is multifaceted and largely reliant on international policy vacuums that allow it to continue: theft of technology and global data collection, debt trapping of developing countries in strategic expansion, exploitation of humans for labor, manipulation of global markets. Tackling these issues require coordination with our allies to set robust international standards. Corrupt dictators rely on loopholes in our own laws, and they use to money launder and enrich themselves with kleptocracy. Regarding technology, the United States can assist our allies in establishing bodies like the Committee on Foreign Investment to review the foreign transactions and prevent technology sales to authoritarian countries. I am grateful to have joined parliamentarians from the United States, European Union, and United Kingdom in launching the Bipartisan Interparliamentary Alliance Against Kleptocracy, coinciding with the Summit for Democracy, to formalize the efforts of working together to combat corruption and kleptocracy that fuels dictators. Through legislation such as the Enablers Act, which I'm grateful to co-lead with Helsinki Commission co-chair Steve Cohen, with Congressman Tom Malinowski and Congresswoman Maria Salazar, the United States puts forward a framework to incentivize the financial sector to address illicit money being introduced into commerce and undermining democracy from within. I'm always reminded by Prime Minister Winston Churchill, we know democracy is the worst system on earth except for all the others. With this, I'm also grateful to see the backgrounds of our panelists today, what extraordinary backgrounds they have, and I look forward to hearing from them. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. And now I'm going to introduce our distinguished roundtable guests. First, Ms. Ann Alperbaum, who's a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. She's also a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins and the Agora Institute, where she co-directs ARENA, a program on disinformation and the 21st century propaganda. A Washington Post columnist for 15 years and a former member of the editorial board, she also covered the collapse of communism as the Warsaw correspondent of The Economist magazine. Then we'll have Mr. Timothy Snyder, who is the Levin Professor of History at Yale University and a permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. Mr. Snyder's work has appeared in 40 languages and has received a number of prizes, including the Havel Foundation Prize, the Foundation for Polish Science Prize in the Social Sciences, the Dutch Auschwitz Committee Award, and the Hannah Aldrich Prize in Political Thought. Mr. Snyder was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford and holds state orders from Estonia, Lithuania, and Poland. I now will turn to Professor Ann Applebaum for her remarks.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, members of Congress, ladies and gentlemen. All of us have in our minds a cartoon image of what we think an autocratic state looks like. There's a bad man at the top and he controls the police, and maybe the police threaten people with violence, and there are collaborators and maybe some dissidents. But in the 21st century, that cartoon really bears very little resemblance to reality. Nowadays, autocracies are run not by one bad guy, but by networks composed of kleptocratic financial structures, many of which are heavily invested in our country and in other democracies, security services, military, police, paramilitary groups, surveillance, and professional propagandists. And the members of these networks are connected not only within a given country, but among many countries. So the corrupt state-controlled companies in one country can do deals with their counterparts in another. The police force in one country can arm and equip and train the police forces in another. The propagandists share resources. They share the troll farms that can promote one dictator's propaganda. They can also promote others. And they share themes, and their themes are pounding home the same message about the weakness of democracy and especially the evil of America. And this is not to say that there is some conspiracy, some super secret room where the bad guys meet, as in a James Bond movie. This new autocratic alliance doesn't have a structure, let alone an ideology. Among the modern autocrats, as Representative Wilson just noted, there are people who call themselves communists, nationalists, and theocrats. Washington likes to talk about China and Chinese influence because that's easy, but actually what really links this group is not China, but rather a common desire to preserve their personal power. So unlike military or political alliances from other times and places, the members of this group don't operate like a bloc, but rather almost like a loose agglomeration of companies. And their links are cemented not by ideals, but by deals. So deals designed to replace Western sanctions, to take the edge off Western economic boycotts, or to make them personally rich. And this is why they can operate so easily across geographical and historical lines. They protect one another, they look after one another. So in theory, Venezuela, a country your committee knows well, is an international pariah. You know, since 2019, US citizens and US companies have been forbidden to do business there, and many other countries have sanctions there as well. And yet Venezuela receives loans as well as oil investment from Moscow and Beijing. Turkey facilitates the illicit Venezuelan gold trade. Cuba has long provided security advisors to Venezuela as well as security technology, and the international narcotics trade keeps individual members of the regime very rich. Leopoldo Lopez, who's one of the stars of the Venezuelan opposition, now living in exile, has observed that although the regime's opponents have received some foreign assistance, it's actually a drop in the bucket, nothing comparable with what Maduro has received. In the face of this new challenge, this systemic challenge, it's not coming from one country, but from many countries, Western and democratic and American responses have been so far inadequate, and that over the past decade. Expressions of deep concern mean nothing to dictators who feel secure thanks to their high levels of surveillance and personal wealth. Western sanctions mean nothing to autocrats who know they can continue to trade with one another. As we are speaking, one of the world's most aggressive dictators, the Russian president, is gathering his troops on the borders of Ukraine, which is a democracy. And he's preparing to invade in part because he has calculated that whatever criticism he receives, whatever sanctions he gets, he can wait them out, he can survive it, he can trade with China, he'll set up his own financial system, he'll cut off gas supplies to Europe, he'll wait for the anger to die down and then carry on. I'll conclude by saying that he's, of course, calculating that there will be no significant Western military support for Ukraine, that there will be no in-kind response to cyber attacks, that there will be no stepped-up support for independent Russian language broadcasting and media, or the Russian opposition. And he is calculating, in other words, that our current strategic posture will not shift. And many others are watching this calculation and they're waiting to see how it plays out. He is, of course, calculating, as are others who are watching, that autocracy, the systemic linked autocracies are stronger and more determined than the world's democracies. I hope that we will prove them wrong, and I hope that this committee will have influence on those decisions. Many thanks for your time and attention today. I very much appreciate this committee holding this meeting.
Thank you, Professor Applebaum. I now turn to Professor Snyder for his remarks.
Chairman Meeks, thank you very much. Representative Wilson, congressmen and women, staff, thank you for organizing this. Ann Applebaum, with whom I'm very glad to be here today, has made a number of excellent points, as it were, from the point of view of the autocratic regimes themselves. What I'd like to do is make a few points about the weakness of democracy from our point of view. So what are the things that are wrong with our systems that we may not see? What are the openings? What are the apertures? What are the vulnerabilities that might be clear from the outside, but which we ourselves might not be able to perceive in our daily work and in our daily life? I think it's important to start by repeating a point that Chairman Meeks and Ann Applebaum have already made in different ways, namely that this is global. Things that happen in Belarus or Slovakia or Venezuela matter in the United States. The people who oppose democracy are at the moment better connected than the people who are in favor of democracy. And it works the other way as well. Every time we pass a voter suppression law, or every time we have a democratic crisis, that is now completely visible all around the world and becomes not only grist for the mill of propaganda in Beijing or Moscow, it's also simply part of the daily existence of people in other democracies who are disheartened by the things that we do. So democracy is in retreat all around the world, and it's not a coincidence. It's a single process of which we are a major part, and in which everything we do immediately has global implications, whether we like that or not. The second point I want to make has to do with the question of ideology, which Ann Applebaum also raised. It's completely correct, I think, to say that in general, our enemies lack an ideology or they lack a common ideology. But we could turn that around a little bit and ask about ourselves, what exactly is it that we stand for? I think we've had a problem in representing what the ideals and the achievements of democracy actually are. After 1989, we took a bit of a mental and a moral break and imagined that history was over, there were no alternatives, democracy would simply be brought about by larger mechanical outside forces, like, for example, capitalism. It's important to recognize that we've learned that that's simply not true. There aren't outside forces, including the market, which is a good thing, but there are no outside forces which bring democracy on their own. Democracy is a matter of people ruling. And if we don't have a good account of why people ruling are better than other systems, then democracy is going to lose. So after this long period where we seem to think democracy was inevitable, we've now in the past, let's say 5 years, shifted to another discussion, which is that democracy is under threat. And certainly it is, but the danger is that we're only on the back foot. We're only talking about the bad actors. We treat democracy as a thing which is somehow surrounded by enemies, but we don't talk about how it's a superior system. I think we need to get back into the habit of talking about democracy as a superior system, not just something which is under threat, not just something which is a kind of historical default, which it isn't, but a superior system, which is worth striving for. Superior morally, because it allows people to be represented, and superior politically, because it leads to better policy outcomes. It actually allows people to solve the problems in their lives. So I think the lack of ideology, in a way, is also a big problem for us. It connects to another problem for us, which is that we're having a hard time talking about the future. Democratic politics works when there are two or more dueling visions of what the future should be. American politics, and interestingly, global politics, has shifted much more into a system where one side talks about a glorious past and the other side is trying to defend the present. We seem to lack, I will mention Republicans and Democrats here, but this is a global trend. We seem to lack visions of how things could be different and better than they are. And without visions of how things are different and better, it's very hard to have a competition of ideas or of political parties. And just as a little aside, I think global warming has a great deal to do with this, because global warming means that young people are distracted from democracy because they see an existential threat. Democracy doesn't rise very high on their list of priorities. And global warming also means that insofar as people look at the future, they think of it as something which is crowding down upon them, which is not what a democracy would like. Okay. A next problem from our point of view is the weakness of factuality. This is a human weakness, our inability to assert the values of truth, which is a problem which comes from the left, but it's also a structural problem having to do with social media and the way that local newspapers have been consumed in this country since 2008. Most counties in the United States no longer have a reporter, which means that most of the geography of the United States is now a news desert. We know from Russia and other examples around the world that when local news goes away and media is consolidated, that's a step towards authoritarian rule. So factuality is something that we need to be supporting. We need to be supporting institutions of factuality, not just the right of freedom of expression, but the institutions that make freedom of expression meaningful, be it around the world, supporting journalists around the world who are doing very courageous things and without whom we wouldn't be able to have this conversation, but also journalists at home. The next point that I wanted to make, picking up on something Representative Wilson mentioned, is inequality of wealth. The networks that Applebaum is talking about take for granted that it's natural for wealth to be pooled in the hands of those who have power, that it's natural for people who have money to run the state, for people who run the state to have money. As everyone from the ancient Greeks onward has pointed out consistently for 2,500 years, that is inconsistent with democratic rule. It's very important to have the kinds of measures in place that Representative Wilson is talking about, whereby autocrats abroad can't park their money with us. But it's also very important for us to keep our own minds and eyes on the problem of wealth inequality in our own country. Wealth, as Plato has Socrates say in the Republic, if you have too much wealth inequality, you don't have one system. You have two systems, one for the rich and one for the poor, and that makes it very hard for most people to believe in democracy. The final problem that I wanted to mention, and it's one that's present around the world in which we see a bit here, is the problem of stagnation or legalism, the problem by which democracy just becomes a matter of laws and not a matter of principles. So a very good example of this is Hungary, where it's hard to say exactly at what moment Hungary ceases to be a rule of law state and a democracy. It's somewhere in the past, but exactly what measure would you point to say this has happened? Everything that happened in their own, according to their own laws, was legal. But nevertheless, at the end of the process, there is no democracy. This kind of salami tactics or death by 1,000 cuts is something that we are vulnerable to. It's also, so it's very important when we think of democracy, not to identify it with legality. There are good laws and there are bad laws. And one way that democracy falls is by laws being passed which slowly undercut the spirit of democracy, up to a moment where you realize, aha, democracy is in the past, up to a moment when people realize, aha, voting is just a kind of ritual. And then you're in this stifling zombie-like situation where things are happening, but people are no longer being represented. That's a way that democracy has been dying around the world. And it's also something for which we are also at risk. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, both Professor Applebaum and Professor Snyder. I want to thank you for those very thought-provoking words. So now we'll turn to the question portion of the agenda. And I'll start off. We have the clock open for all members. We'll have 5 minutes to ask questions. After which you will be called in seniority order. Let me address my first question to Professor Snyder. You know, I always say in many of my remarks, the camera of history is recording what we're doing today to protect our democracy and moving forward, because people will look back, history will look back and judge what we did do or didn't do. So as I think about Russia today, how does today's Russia use history, which it seems Mr. Putin is doing, in order to justify its action in Ukraine, for example? And should we treat, how would you say we should treat and look at history as members of Congress to help us to judge what we should or should not do to preserve democracy in our country and globally?
Thank you, Chairman Meeks, for that terrific and I think quite profound question. I'm going to make a very superficial point, and then I'm going to get to your question about history. The very superficial point is that democracies tend to be more peaceful than authoritarian systems. The more democratic you are, the harder it is to assemble a coalition for a foolish war. So in a very straightforward way, what we're witnessing with Russia and Ukraine has to do with democracy. Mr. Putin is in a classic authoritarian situation where he has to provide some kind of spectacle, some kind of victory, and it can't have to do with domestic politics, because domestic politics are totally blocked by oligarchy, or what Representative Wilson called kleptocracy. Therefore, he's in that natural situation that dictators have been throughout the ages, where you have to do something else. You have to push the country's energies abroad. You have to put attention abroad. You have to do something militaristic. But the question about history is extremely well taken. On the surface, Mr. Putin's demands about Ukraine have to do with a kind of rewriting of history. He's basically asking America to concede to his dream world in which the Soviet Union never collapsed, that Soviet allies were always willing Soviet allies, that everything was somehow the responsibility of the United States, that East European countries don't have their own aspirations. There's this very strong counter history, which Russian diplomats are forced to mouth, which makes it very difficult to have a conversation. At a deeper level, what Mr. Putin has done is turn history into a kind of myth about the past in which we are always right, and the dictator gets to decide who we are. So Russia has in place a set of memory laws which make it a criminal offense to speak, for example, about the way the Second World War began, which was as an alliance between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. It is a crime in Russia, and you can be punished for speaking the wrong way about Stalin and the Second World War. As I'm sure many of you will know, Memorial, which is a group of courageous Russian historians and activists, the people who have done the most to bring to light the history of the Gulag and the terror in the Soviet Union, are under attack now in Russia. So suppressing history in the name of a myth controlled by a dictator is part of the anti-democratic playbook, and an essential part. And we know why. The reason why is that democracy is all about self-correction. Democracy involves saying, hey, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I voted for the wrong person. And that's true at the level of a democratic nation as well. A democratic nation is one that's able to say, hey, maybe we made a mistake not giving women the right to vote. Hey, maybe we made a mistake not giving Blacks the right to vote. Hey, maybe we made a mistake with A, B, C, and D. And you can only have that discussion that allows self-correction if you have history, right? And history is always going to be a little uncomfortable. History is always going to involve divisive concepts. History is always going to involve students coming into a classroom and learning things that they didn't learn at home and being surprised by them. So in order to have a democratic future, it's very important to have the courage to concentrate openly and with discussion and with evidence on your own past.
Thank you. Let me ask real quickly, Professor Alperbaum. And I've heard, the conversation about autocracy versus democracy, and oftentimes we think of us versus them. I think that's the easiest thing to do, but it's not binary. There's nefarious actors, and they seem to exploit, in my opinion, pre-existing conditions within societies. And disinformation in today's world, for example, on social media, even on cable networks, So in your work on disinformation, what are the easiest pre-existing conditions for a dictator to exploit to move even a democracy to an authoritarian society?
So thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. You're absolutely right that this is not binary in the sense that all of us here in North America are the good guys and the bad guys are somewhere else. One of the great successes that autocracies have had, not just in our country, but in many other democracies over the past couple of decades, has been in creating their own influence operations. Some of them we know about, disinformation operations, the use of social media, the use of new technology, but also through political influence campaigns, through the buying and selling politicians. There are a couple of famous examples. A former chancellor of Germany now works for a major Russian company. There are other examples like that too. Through the use of purchasing companies. This is something that Russia does, that China does, that other countries do. If they can own large companies and then use the power of those companies to influence our politics and the politics of our allies, they will do so. And so thinking of, it's important that we understand that, okay, it's nice to talk about the bad guys and makes it easier, but the bad guys are also among us, or the part of the problem that we have to deal with is making sure that we are not hosts for sources of autocratic influence and for disinformation. The answer to the disinformation story is, as you can imagine, is a long one. But let me just say that there is one element that almost everywhere is probably the most conducive factor in a society that leads to more people believing disinformation and being vulnerable to disinformation campaigns, and that's polarization. So when you have deep political divisions, as we have in our country, as we have in Poland, the country I spend a lot of time in, as exist in Russia, as exist in other places, and where there's profound levels of distrust between different parts of society, it's much easier to convince people to believe in mythologies about one side or the other. And so I believe there are technical solutions to some of the some of the traps that social media has created. There would be ways to mitigate that. Maybe that's for a conversation for another day. But it's also important to understand that the fundamental basis, the reason why disinformation works, is because our politics and the politics of many of our allies have built up these high levels of distrust between different sectors of society. And thinking about how to heal that is part of the answer.
Thank you very much. My time has long expired. I now will turn to Mr. Wilson for his questions, after which Angela will call on members in seniority order and alternate between Democrats and Republicans. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Chairman Greg Meeks. And what a wonderful hearing we're having. What a wonderful way to end the week. It really is a bipartisan concern with the chairman's leadership and working with Ranking Member McCall, and over again to have two professors come who are making such a difference. And this has just been reassuring. For Ms. Applebaum in particular, I want you to be aware, we have a shared heritage, as you are married to a Polish citizen. My oldest son, Alan, the Attorney General of South Carolina, is very happily married to a Polish-American journalist. So, and your service there in Poland, golly, what a time in history. How in the world did you get there in 1988? But anyway, and how fortuitous. With that, and you cited, and gruesomely we see this, that the autocrats are working together. In fact, yesterday was another horrible example, and that is that the mass murderer turned illegitimate Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, visited the Kremlin yesterday, and reports indicate that they're planning joint naval exercises with China, Russia, and Iran. What can we do, or how does this indicate a concern truly about how effective we can be working in a democracy?
Thank you very much for that question, and congratulations to your son on being married to a Polish citizen. that alliance that you've just described illustrates something I was saying. There we have Russia, which is a nationalist dictatorship. We have China, which describes itself as communist, and we have Iran, which describes itself as a theocracy, and yet they are all able to work together. To me, the response has to be in the re-strengthening and in the reordering of our own alliances and thinking more broadly about what our alliances are for. If Ukraine was, I'm not saying it needs to be a member of NATO, but if Ukraine had been reinforced militarily, if it knew that if Putin was certain that that Europe and America would come to its aid in the case of an invasion, we probably wouldn't be where we are today. And although I do think that many of the solutions to the kinds of problems we're talking about are in the realm of funding for media, in the realm of promoting democratic oppositions, in promoting links between democratic oppositions, there's also a piece of this story that has a military component. And making sure that our military alliances, both in Europe and in Asia, and in other parts of the world, are functional and working, that we are exercising constantly, and that we act and think as alliances. And we think in terms of democratic alliances, in other words, that we are democracies and we come to the aid of other democracies, and so that other people know that. I think that would at least give the autocrats some pause to think about it before they act.
Thank you so much. And again, I too share your view. Deterrence, golly, we've just got to be focused on deterrence and not to figure out how do you respond to mass murder. And then Professor Snyder, I agree with you. You were citing that we need to point to the positive, as Chairman Meeks did in the beginning, America, the greatest country democracy. I was an election observer in Bulgaria in 1990. I felt like I was stepping back in the 1930s. It was pathetic. I was there this summer. What a modern country it is today, and vibrant country with opportunity for the young people. And so to see the blessings of democracy, we need somehow really to get that point across. And with that, and it really goes back again to our concern with Ukraine today. And that is, to me, something's got to be done. And I wish the president, and I've urged him to make a statement to clarify that Nord Stream 2 would be terminated if there was an invasion. We need to cut off the financing of the authoritarian regime. What would your view be about Nord Stream 2?
My view of Nord Stream 2 was that it was a scandal from the very beginning. Nord Stream 2, we shouldn't even be talking about having to cancel it now. It should never have arisen. Nord Stream 2 was a matter of Germany and other of our partners rewarding Russia for invading Ukraine in the first place. But Nord Stream 2 was a way for Russia to reinsure its position, having just invaded its neighboring country. So from my point of view, Nord Stream 2 is a scandal from the very beginning. And obviously, that we could remove it now, of course, but that's my view of Nord Stream 2.
Thank you so much. And I yield back, but I say amen to what you said. Thank you very much.
We'll now start with Representative Deutsch for 5 minutes.
Ted, I think you're on mute.
Well, you missed some very wise words, David. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for doing this, and to both of our witnesses. I was disappointed when this was canceled before, and I was truly looking forward to it. Your insight is so helpful and to us as we struggle through these issues. And I would ask, in light of Ms. Applebaum, what you just said, asking us to rethink what alliances are for. I would ask both of you, given the conversation thus far, given Professor Snyder, you talked about the zombie-like democracy that we have, and the challenges with young people, and obviously rise of autocrats around the world, and democracy is about self-correction, all of the things that we've been talking about thus far. If we were starting fresh as we look to countries around the world, what should be the basis for our alliances? Where does democracy fit in, and how important, how central, how necessary is the focus on democracy as it relates to security concerns and the other areas that we typically think of when we talk about our alliances? I'd love to hear from both of you on that.
Tim, would you like to begin?
Sure. I mean, Representative Deutsch, I guess I'd begin by suggesting that the distinction between democracy and our security concerns may be a false distinction. I don't think that there is a greater threat to the security of the United States right now than democratic collapse. And democratic collapse is something which has a domestic component, which is not so much our subject today, and it also has a component in international affairs. So my first response would be to say, there shouldn't really be a higher security priority, I don't think, than the affirmation of democracy around the world. And that leads to, as others have already suggested, to a set of practical recommendations about what you do in moments of crisis. For example, with Russia and Ukraine, it allows you to identify Ukraine as a democracy which is under threat from an autocracy, right? It gives you not only a sense of who your friends are, it also gives you a sense of what you're supposed to be doing. I mean, I think, given what Ann Applebaum and others have said about the lack of a clear ideological opponent, right? I mean, we might be against theocracy, we might be against extreme nationalism, we might be against communism, but there's no bullseye there, right? It's not the Cold War anymore. We have to be clear. We have to be clear about what we are ourselves. I think so. That's why I really like the notion of a summit for democracy rather than a summit of democracies. The idea that the goal of an alliance could be, as Ann Applebaum has said, the goal of alliances could be not just to keep democracies going, but to strengthen democracies. That the ultimate aim, is not the containment of not democracy. The ultimate aim is the spread of democracy as a better system. That all seems very coherent to me.
Ms. Applebaum, can I sharpen the question just a bit, since I only have a little time left, and ask you to speak also to the place that social media plays, either in spreading democracy or preventing the spread of democracy and strengthening autocracy.
So yes, thank you very much. Yes, I would echo what Tim just said first about understanding what we do as being for democracy rather than against China or against Iran. It's a useful way to clarify the situation and to understand who our allies are. And we may even occasionally have allies who are non-democracies. I'm not excluding that kind of relationship. But understanding fundamentally what we are for and who we are is very important. I mean, look, the problem with social media is that social media is not structured to promote democracy or even promote goodwill or promote good relationships with people or even to promote good conversation. The social media, the algorithms that determine what it is that we all see are designed to promote emotion, sometimes conflict, anger, disagreement. Those are the things that make messages spread faster online. I don't think that social media is the only source of our current divisions and the divisions we see in so many other democracies, but certainly they are part of what has created more difficult conversations. And the problem is not to do with what particular people are posting, and the need is not for some form of censorship. But there is a need to look at the social media algorithms, how they function, who controls them, who decides what they promote and don't promote. Because as I say, right now, they are not set up to promote civil debate. They're set up to promote almost exactly the opposite, to create more anger and emotion and division. And I do hope that the US Congress will eventually look at the problem from this angle. It's not about who gets to decide what's taken down and who speaks and who doesn't. It's a question of what is the metric by which the algorithms are operating. And it seems to me there would be a bipartisan way to agree that we want civil conversation or that we want measured and balanced language. And of course, one of one of the first countries to understand how this function was Russia, and that was why they were able to use social media so successfully, both in the United States and in other countries. And they were also able to use the anonymity to disguise the true origins of messages. That's another piece of the puzzle that could be solved. But other autocracies have worked out the same thing, as have groups inside our own country on both sides of the political spectrum. So yes, I do think that finding some fixes for that problem will help in the long run.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
We will now turn to Representative Shabbat for his questions.
Before Mr. Shabbat asks his question, I want members to know that we've had votes on the floor. I understand that there's 3 votes. I don't know how many members, if there are any members there that are voting remotely, but what we will do is if some who are voting remotely or not voting remotely can go and vote and come back, and then we can let the questions continue, those that don't have to leave. And then we'll try to figure it out so that we can continue the process without interruption, with members alternating to go to vote and coming back if they have not the opportunity to ask their questions. Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you. I'm somewhat torn at this point. I thought you might be recessing, Mr. Chairman, because I'm not voting remotely. I'm part of the lawsuit that says we shouldn't be doing that, et cetera. So I guess how about I go vote and I'll come back because I don't want to miss votes. And so when my turn comes up as the next Republican, I'll go then if that's acceptable.
Acceptable to me, yes.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll yield back to the next Republican. Thank you.
We will now turn to Representative Issa for his questions. We will now turn to Representative Mast for his questions.
So let me check. Are there any Republicans that are still on? Or have all the Republicans gone to vote? That being the case, I don't see any Republicans on the screen at this point. We will continue with the Democrats that are there. And then in fairness, when one or more come back of Republicans, then we may go in order and have 2 or 3 go directly. So, Angel, let's go to the next Democrat.
We will now turn to Representative Keating for his questions.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank our witnesses. I appreciate this opportunity. Number one, just quick clarification. With Nord Stream 2, right now, talking to my German officials just a couple of days ago, as well as reiterating former Chancellor Merkel's position and Chancellor Olaf Scholz's position, they will not go ahead operationally with Nord Stream 2 should Russia be aggressive in Ukraine. Now, Professor Snyder, I just want to quickly agree with you in terms of messaging. We have to do a better job saying democracy is a superior system. When I've talked to other leaders and some of the countries I'm going to reference privately, we're talking about their greatest needs. It was always young people losing hope, no chance for a job or a future. The aspirational benefits of a democracy provide these young people with hope. And I think we have to do a better job. Professor Applebaum, I'm engaged in reading your book, Red Famine. I appreciate your efforts. But I want to deal with the issues of what the US should do looking itself in the mirror, a hard look. Number one, we have to do more combating kleptocracies. We're doing that we have Congressional Kleptocracy Caucus now. I have the Crooks Act, which was part of the Chairman's Eagle Act, which was passed. That'll give us the resources necessary to do this at every embassy. And we have to look at transparency. And I point this out because it's so obvious and we have to talk about it. The former president's conflicts are rampant, and they were rampant in terms of conflicts. His conversations with Erdogan just prior to making his decision in Ukraine, surrounded or initiated by saying the properties he had in Istanbul, in Turkey. The person who was given the position in the Middle East to oversee what was going on there, Jared Kushner, having business interests with the Saudis. And even issues like the president trying to gain the prestigious golf course championship at his Scottish owned properties with the UK. These are all examples of how we have to be more transparent and put safeguards ourselves, as well as the kleptocracy and money laundering we're involved with in the UK as two prominent countries. So how can we better face these issues? And isn't it important if we're going to try and influence other countries that we are clear and do everything we can on these issues ourselves?
If I may answer, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And it's not only me who agrees with that, it's the Russian opposition, it's the Venezuelan opposition, it's the Belarusian opposition. If you were to ask, active Democrats who are working in autocracies around the world, what is the single most important thing that they would like to see happen? It would be the end of money laundering, the end of kleptocracy, the end of Russian oligarchs or Kazakh oligarchs or Chinese oligarchs using our financial system and our weak company ownership laws to hide their money. Because this is one of their main sources of power. This is how they stay in power. This is how they keep their money. They don't come from rule of law societies, so they like to park their money in places that do have the rule of law. And if we can end those practices, both at the national level, at the state level, as you surely know, we have a particular problem in the United States with some states that have lax company laws and trust laws that have enabled people to anonymously park their money. I know there's a lot of legislation on this. I was actually glad to see that the Biden administration now puts kleptocracy as, within the foreign policy basket. It's now part of what the State Department looks at. It was part of the conversation at the Democracy Summit. It's not just something that Treasury does, it's something that is moving to the center of our foreign policy. And I think that's really crucial and important. Both for our own system, as you say, it's very easy for people inside our own country to have corrupt connections and to bring those into American politics, but also for the sake of democracy movements around the world. Many autocrats are able to stay in power thanks to their Western connections, thanks to their Western banks. And if we, together with our allies, you mentioned the UK, but also Germany, France, Singapore, and others, if we can work together with our allies to prevent that, we'll make a big difference.
Don't you think it has to be better addressed here in our own country with our own leaders? I gave you the examples with the former president, for instance, when an American resident was killed brutally and cut up, by the Saudis. The American president's response was later on that he had tried to help cover that up and move it forward. And he had business interests in Turkey and in Saudi Arabia. So these are, don't you think we have to strengthen our own transparency here with our own leaders?
Absolutely. Transparency at home, transparency about what people's business interests are around the world, transparency of company laws, an end to anonymous shell companies being able to own property in the US, which is, by the way, a mechanism by which American business people, including the former president, were able to take money from around the world, without anybody knowing it. All of those things are hugely important, both for our own political system, but also for the cause of democracy around the world.
Good. Well, thank you for your work enlightening us all. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Cicilline.
Thank you very much. Thank you for convening this roundtable, and thank you, Professor Applebaum and Professor Snyder, for your extraordinary presentation and the work you're doing. My first question is, we have focused a lot on, in my subcommittee, on the dissemination of false information and the ability of these gigantic platforms, as you said, Professor Applebaum, not just to allow, but really a business model that is designed so that the most provocative, the most untrue, the most controversial things are shared. And so it's a business model that really facilitates false information, sometimes very dangerous. And so this idea of attacking the way that information is shared in both the United States and around the world is critical in this fight, because I think one of the most powerful tools that authoritarians are using is widely accepted disinformation. People just are accepting things which are not true. That is very much facilitated by social media platforms who are designed to really be a partner in that work. I mean, that's their business model. So I think it's a problem here in the United States. We saw it in the results of January 6th. It's a problem around the world. And so I think until we fix that, we're not going to remove what I see as the most powerful tool that emerging autocrats can use. I'd just like your thoughts on that, Professor Applebaum.
So as I said previously, I absolutely agree with that. As I say, it's not the only source of polarization. Social media is not the only source of disinformation. But tackling that would eliminate a good deal of the emotion and anger that are so common. Remember, not just in our politics, but in the politics of our allies in Great Britain, in Germany, and Austria, and France, and many other places. I mean, you can see the impact of this, the higher level of emotion and division everywhere. And as I said, I do believe that it is possible to address this by addressing the regulation, or at least the demand for some kind of transparency about the algorithms that are used, and have some kind of social input into that. I also think that ending, or at least changing, the degree of anonymity that's allowed online would also make a big difference. And I think these are things that can be done. I think the social media companies would accept that kind of regulation. Again, it's not censorship. It's not about taking things down. Yeah. It could be done in a bipartisan way.
Yeah. I can just suggest you politely, they won't accept them. They resist any of these reforms, but that's a conversation for another day. We got to do it. And it relates very much to what Professor Snyder said about the loss of local, trustworthy, reliable news. It's directly related to the ability of these platforms to just gobble up the content. But my real question, as I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking about the conduct of elected officials in our own country. You talked about challenging the truth and promoting a lie. We have that with the claim that Joe Biden didn't really win the election and Donald Trump really did. The attack on trustworthy, reliable news sources as fake news. We have attacks on the judiciary and the willful failure to follow or comply with lawfully issued subpoenas. And so I think, one of the things that we've got to look at, and I frankly think many of our Republican colleagues need to sort of understand, what damage does that do in our effort to show the world how democracy works, when so many of the characteristics that you both described are happening in America by a major political party? So what is that? How does that translate to both emerging authoritarian leaders? How does it translate to people who are trying to fight for democracy in other places around the world? What damage is being done by the failures in our own country by elected officials who display exactly the same behavior you've described?
So
I'd like you both to respond if you could.
Look, it's hard. I mean, it's hard to answer that question because the answer is already in the question. I mean, it's for people around the world who are taking risks for democracy, who are risking going to prison, right? I have friends and colleagues, especially in Eastern Europe right now, who are in prison, who are suffering in other ways, or are traumatized in other ways, or who have been killed for that matter, because they've taken risks for human rights and for democracy. For people like that to look at the United States and see such gross dereliction, such obvious contradiction with the principles that we're supposed to hold is very disheartening. It's also practically a tremendous problem because we demoralize people. When we don't set a good example, we make it harder for those courageous people to organize and gather other people around them. So what's happened, what we have done in the last few years has been demoralizing. And to put it a different way, when and this goes back to Anne Applebaum's point about the lack of ideology, when we act as though the only thing that matters is money and power, and that money and power naturally go together, what we're doing is blessing all of the other people who say that, whatever their cover ideology is. When we say, as Mr. Trump all too often did, that all that matters is the transaction, all that matters is the outcome. We're not just disempowering the people who are taking risks, we're empowering those who say values are a joke, facts are a joke, it's all just a game. It's all about me and me staying in power and me having money.
Professor Applebaum?
Yes, I would add to that you know, we all know what the United States has done for democracy over the years. We were part of alliances. We were part of NATO. We formed and created NATO, in fact. And you know, and we have some good tools that we've used to talk about democracy. The Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, now Radio Free Asia. But really, the most important tool, the most convincing argument for democracy that we always had was our own example. It was always the power of the American example. Even people who hated some aspects of our society or who thought we made mistakes around the world, nevertheless often admired that the democratic urge in our society, the ability to reflect on history and to correct mistakes that Tim Snyder spoke about a few minutes ago, the openness of our conversation. Of course, our economic success is part of the package as well, but it wasn't the only thing. The power of our example was one of the most important sources for the spread of democracy around the world over the last century, really. And the loss of that example, the fact that we are no longer seen as a leading democracy, that we are seen as a profoundly troubled democracy, has an impact everywhere. Again, it's part of why Russia and China and Iran and Venezuela and so many other countries feel they can move forward. It's part of what gives them the belief that they can win, is the perception of that our democracy is damaged and that therefore democracy in other places is weakened. So yes, I agree with the premise of your question. The power of the American example was always our best tool, and losing it and we have in part lost it already, is part of what's happening now, and it's part of really a profound tragedy.
Thank you so much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Representative Liu.
Thank you, Chairman Meeks, for holding this important hearing on democracy. I'd like to start off with democracy at home. I note that the former president lost a popular election by over 7 million votes, and he lost multiple electoral states. Yet many Republicans continue to push the big lie that somehow the election was stolen. And that's what in part led to January 6th attack on our Capitol, where 140 law enforcement officers were brutalized. I also note that this big lie is continuing. And even though it's been more than a year since the presidential election, Republicans still cannot explain who stole the election, nor how it was done. And that's because the election was not stolen. The former president simply lost. However, we continue to see this big lie animating possible future political violence. There are some bright spots. Then Republican Attorney General Bill Barr did tell the former president to his face that the election conspiracy claims were, quote, bullshit. We also have current Senator Mike Rounds, who recently came out and said, basically, Biden won, the election was fair, and he urged other Republicans to start saying the same thing. So my question for the witnesses is, how important do you think it is that Republicans start telling the truth and say one simple statement that the election was not stolen for purposes of bolstering democracy?
Well, so I thank you very much for that question. I mean, I was very concerned back in November and December of 20 about what Mr. Trump was doing, and that's when I started talking about the big lie. I mean, the big lie, a lie this big, has the consequence that it creates an alternative reality for people to live in, and that alternative reality includes media safe spaces in the right, and it can create, as you've suggested, a kind of filter for who really belongs to a political party and who really doesn't belong to a political party. It also has the consequence that truth becomes not what you and I can find out, but truth becomes whatever comes out of the mouth of the person who's at the center of the cult of personality. All those things are irreconcilable with democracy, as is fundamentally something which sometimes goes unnoticed, which is the issue of victimhood. What the big lie does is that it takes someone who is very powerful, and it was in fact the president of the United States, and turns him into a victim. It takes someone who actually tried to overcome an election and turns him into a victim. And then, because once the big lie makes you a victim, it then authorizes you to do whatever you want. It authorizes you not to play by the rules. And I mention this because it's a historical point. This is a tactic which precisely, I mean, I hate to reach for these examples too readily, but this is a tactic which precisely was used by the Nazis. The idea that we are the victims. We are the ones who have been oppressed, and therefore we have the right to do whatever we want. So the big lie is extremely dangerous in the United States. I wished very much that in 2020, there would have been more Americans, especially more Republicans, who had simply accepted the basic reality much sooner, because we've let this thing get way out of hand. A political science point is that the big lie means that you have a political party who is concentrating on gaming the system as opposed to policy. And the problem with gaming the system is that you become addicted to gaming the system. The more you try to game the system, the less you're interested in your constituents, the less you're interested in policy. You get to the point where it's an addiction and you can do nothing else except game the system. And that leads to stagnation. It leads to resistance. I mean, if you get to a situation where you game the system too hard, people no longer believe in the system and they just say, oh, it's a game and we're not going to play anymore. And so I agree with very much with the premise of your question, Representative Liu. It's absolutely essential, and the sooner the better that we get back to common sense on this issue, and then compete over policy differences rather than competing by trying to warp the system.
Thank you.
I'm happy to echo those sentiments, and also to add, one further reflection, which is that really most autocrats have come to power on the back of well-organized lies that are designed to create distrust. What is the function of the big lie, of the lie that the 2020 election was stolen? It creates among a part of the population a conviction that everything they believed in is wrong, that every political institution is false or is lying. Congress is lying to you, the FBI, the CIA, the police, the people who count the votes, everybody's lying. And this creates a sense of profound distrust on a part of the population. And it's that distrust, it's that group of people who feel alienated from the country and alienated from its politics, who then see no other recourse, they see no other ability to influence events except through violence. And that is that's a phenomenon that we have seen repeated before. I could cite to you multiple autocracies where that cycle has completed itself. And one of the reasons I'm so worried about it happening in the United States is because I recognize it, as I said from other times and places, not just the Germany of the 1930s, but many others. And this, of course, is why it's so important that people who do have influence in that part of the population, whether it's political leaders, whether it's members of Congress, whether it's business people, whether it's religious leaders, that they begin to work with that part of the population in order to bring them back into the mainstream political system, to convince them that democracy works. And I hope that some people, listening to this call, reflect on that and try to end this deep division in our society.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Representative Jacobs.
Well, thank you. This has been a really interesting conversation. During the Cold War, in many cases, the United States calculated that countering communism and the Soviet Union was worth supporting authoritarian regimes. And I would argue that we're having similar conversations now about that same calculation. So I was hoping you could talk about how you think about that question and how it relates to the broader question of backsliding among democracies and rising authoritarianism, and what kinds of lessons would be helpful for us to think about from the Soviet era in this terms of who we're picking as our partners.
If I understand the question correctly, it's about lessons from the Cold War for the present. That's a little tricky because we're not in a Cold War situation. We're not facing a single ideological enemy operating in many different countries around the world. We're facing this variety of enemies. But the deeper premise of your question, which is that we should be looking for allies, we should be building on and structuring our alliances, I think is absolutely right. And I think that the main thing we should be thinking about is what is it that our allies should be doing with us today? So if in the past it was, if we were looking at, civil, military defense, we were looking at a land war in Europe, how would we operate together? What does interoperability look like? Now we should be focused on things like, how do we get our anti-kleptocracy and anti-money laundering laws all on the same page? How can we make sure that we and the Germans and the French and the Japanese and the Australians are thinking the same way about sanctions and boycotts? How can we use our resources, in America, in Britain, in Asia, in South America, to support independent media around the world? In other words, the tools that we should be using to fight autocracy, we should be doing all of them in concert with others. And that's.
Can I just jump in? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I guess the point I think our alliances are incredibly important, and I think the point I'm trying to ask about, though, is that not often, some of our allies are actually in this authoritarian camp themselves. I mean, even some of the countries that you guys have cited are, NATO treaty allies. So how do we think about our alliances and our partnerships and how we're building this structure in the context of democracy and rising authoritarianism?
Okay, so I think, I think, I think in a way we're in a simpler situation than in the Cold War, in that in the Cold War, because communism was coherent, it was easy to be drawn in on the side of other anti-communists. Now the palette of enemies of democracy is so confusing and mutually contradictory that we don't face the same kind of temptation to believe that that everyone who's an anti-communist is on our side, as we did during the Cold War. I think a lesson from the Cold War is something that I wanted to say before, which is that we did well in the Cold War when we used it to promote a sense of what was good about democracy. And that included in areas as widespread as, arts and literature and things, things that we actively promoted. We actively promoted the progressive side of American culture during the Cold War to young people around the world with a great deal of success. And then I guess the other thing which is interesting about your question is that because there was a coherent enemy in the Cold War, it often pushed us in the right direction on domestic issues, such as civil rights, for example, such as the welfare state, for example. And now because communism pushed us in certain ways, we kind of missed that. Like we missed the rival from the left, because now we just have the rival, which is kind of cynicism and money gathering everywhere. And so one thing which is harder about the end of the Cold War is that we have to assert these things ourselves and not just as an opposition to someone else. We have to be, I think, clearer about what we actually stand for. But I take the point of your question. I think it was actually a harder problem to crack during the Cold War than it is now. The missing thing, the word that we're not using enough in my view is Europe. and the European Union. The European Union, I mean, not every member of the European Union is any longer a democracy, but most of them are. It's the biggest, most important, wealthiest set of contiguous democracies in the world. Its economy is comparable to ours. We can't handle kleptocracy or China or Russia, really, or anything else without the Europeans. And so when we say our allies, I guess I would add sort of specificity about that. A lot of our really important democratic allies are in this thing called the European Union.
Thank you. I yield back.
Representative Manning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for holding this very important hearing, and thank you to our witnesses. Dr. Snyder, you mentioned as one of your concerns the weakness of agreeing on facts and reality. We've talked about that quite a bit. You point to the demise of the local press, which I agree is an enormous problem, particularly I see it in my district. But we're seeing the growth of conspiracy theories and misinformation, which I don't believe would be remedied by local press, and which frankly, throughout history, have been a dangerous indicator of sickness in democracy. And I'll use it as an example, a spike in anti-Semitic conspiracies, like the growing fallacies that Jews are responsible for COVID. And I'll pair that with a deficit in knowledge about the history and the impact of anti-Semitism. For instance, according to a survey, a recent Pew Research survey, too many American adults know very little about the Holocaust. Less than half of all adult respondents knew that 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust, and just 43% knew that Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany through a democratic political process. So how can we combat conspiracy theories? It's hard to believe that rational adults actually believe some of these things. And how do we increase knowledge and understanding of history and the importance not only of democracy, but of what democracy really means?
Right. So, I mean, number one, social media is a conspiracy factory. It's that social media works to promote conspiracies, and unfortunately, the idea of a Jewish international conspiracy is probably the conspiracy which works best on social media, and that's one of the reasons why we've had this revival. I mean, and it is, you're right, it's absolutely unmistakable. There's a revival of, you know, if this is the right word, but of classic global anti-Semitism. Thanks in large measure to social media, with certain variants which are not at first glance obviously the same thing, but really are the same thing, like QAnon. So the notion that that the bad guys are snatching children and taking them away for their nefarious purposes comes straight from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. I mean, it doesn't always mention Jews by name, but it's a classic anti-Semitic trope. So I guess I think the first thing to recognize is what you've already said, which is that social media is actually set up in a way that promotes conspiracy thinking. It's set up in a way that to draw people towards simple explanations, which give them easy gratification, right? Because the reason why conspiracy theories are attractive is that they give you an answer for everything, right? They explain everything to you all at once. And that's what social media does. It's the algorithms are set up in such a way as to give you the stuff that you want to hear and the stuff that you fear. And a conspiracy theory does both. It affirms the way you want to understand the world, and it makes you afraid at the same time. So it's absolute candy on social media, unfortunately, which means that, as an Applebaum has said, we have to talk about the algorithms. And this is totally normal. Every time there's a new medium, whether it's radio or the newspaper or the book, it brings complete chaos to politics and society. And people have to get together to think of new institutions to guide that medium in a better direction, right? So I think we have to think very big about what we do with social media, including, having default settings, where the default settings being that people get local news, the default settings being supporting investigative reporting, and people have to choose to take that away, right? We have to think seriously about taxing a lot more to support the things, to internalize the externalities, right? So that, I think that we have to think very seriously about the social media. And then the other side of your question, I mean, the local news helps in ways that we don't always see, because it creates trust in factuality, right? It creates a sense that maybe there are reporters are people. It fills in some of the space. But I take your point that we've neglected history. I don't think democracy can do without history. I think the move that we've taken in the last 30 years, that democracy is all about technique. It's all about problem solving. It's all about the how. It's not about the why. I think we've taken that way too far. Democracy is about the why. It's about why are we all equal? Why are we all represented? Why do we all have rights? And as you say, the history of the Holocaust and history in general is an important way, if not the only way, to get at those deeper questions. And to go back to something which was asked earlier, the Holocaust was once a divisive concept, right? The Holocaust was a divisive concept in post-war Germany. The Holocaust is a divisive concept in France right now. When teaching history, we have to teach the hard stuff. We have to teach that the United States didn't take Jewish refugees in the 1930s. We have to teach what actually happened during Reconstruction. If we want to deal with the hard problems now, we have to teach the hard things in the past. That's what history is actually for. And we've really lost that. So as a historian, I know I'm pleading my own case, but it's something which I feel very strongly.
My time has expired, but I certainly hope we can continue this conversation and at a time when we can all be in the same room at the same time. Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Manning. Member questions are now concluded and Chair Meeks will begin his closing remarks.
Yeah, let me apologize to if any member has not had the opportunity to speak. Our guest has had a hard stop at 11 o'clock. And that's why I have to stop. But this has been very intriguing. In fact, I'm thinking about if our guest would, I'd love to have an open and an official hearing with you coming in to testify and to talk to all the full committee when we were back in regular order and regular session. This briefing has been, I think, very enlightening and important. And we need to make sure that we communicate with our American citizens, because indeed democracy is at stake. It's at stake right here today. And due to the fast-paced nature of our jobs and our lives, we do not always get to stop and think about the bigger questions about what this institution and what democracy means in the world. We clearly are at a pivotal moment in history, and decisions are being made by leaders and actors here and abroad that, influenced by trends and technology, will reshape the human experience. So that reshaping, in my opinion, can have enormous consequences on our freedom, our democracy, and our American project. The summit that launched last month is a rallying call, in my opinion, and the injection of energy and a reminder of what the world stands to lose if we are not vigilant. And again, I just want to thank our guests so much for their time and their insights, and look forward to working with you and my colleagues on this committee, as well as the democracies around the world and the administration, the civil society, actors striving for a better future for their people, to ensure that we pass on a stronger, more resilient democracies to our children and our grandchildren. I often say, well, what we're here to do is to make sure that tomorrow is better for our children than our today or yesterday. So thank you so very much for being here. I look forward to asking you to come back again so that we can continue this conversation. And this briefing now was